So we've talked about how anthropology fits into the much larger field of science in general. In our second lecture, I want to start talking about anthropology specifically and introduce some of the basic terms and concepts that we use to structure our investigations of the human experience. First, recall the definition of anthropology: the holistic, scientific study of all aspects of the human condition. To conduct science, we use theoretical constructs to explain patterns in the data. In anthropology, our data are observations of the human condition, that is, observations of the lives that people lead and the behaviors they engage in. Our theoretical constructs are generally abstract concepts that attempt to explain those behaviors. The most basic concepts used by all anthropology are society and culture, though the textbook pays much more attention to the concept of culture, which is common in anthropology texts from the American tradition. Unfortunately for students, in common usage, society and culture are more or less synonyms. When we talk about American culture, we mean largely the same thing we mean by American society. But in technical usage, these are distinct concepts, and in fact, each has two distinct meanings. That means that there are actually four concepts we need to discuss. Two meanings are more abstract, and two are more concrete. To distinguish abstract from concrete, I'm going to use a convention that your book doesn't. When I capitalize the term, I'm talking about the abstract meaning. When it's lowercase, then I'm talking about the more concrete idea. But remember that your textbook doesn't distinguish things this way. It always uses lowercase, so you need to pay special attention to context to understand which meaning is intended. First, society. When the word is in lowercase, it's being used in its more concrete sense. This concept can also be pluralized. We can talk about one society or many societies. We can also add an article to it, a society or the society. A society is people living together in a group, usually with face-to-face interactions on a daily basis. Clyde Kluckhohn, one of the founding fathers of anthropology in the early 20th century, defined it like this: a society is a group of people who interact more with each other than they do with other individuals, who cooperate with each other for attainment of certain ends. A single Indian tribe like the Shawnee would comprise a society, as would the modern United States. The boundaries of a society are always very indistinct. Not all Shawnee live together with daily face-to-face interactions, and certainly not all Americans do. So society, in this sense, is just an approximation, a useful concept to focus our thinking, but not an absolute. It's only as important as it is useful. You'll find that many concepts in anthropology are like this. When society is capitalized, I'm using it in its more abstract sense. This abstract concept is not something that can be pluralized, nor can you use a or the with it. Society in this sense refers to all the relationships that people form among themselves and among groups in order to make a living. Humanity is a social animal. For the most part, we can't survive and thrive in the absence of contact with others of our kind. Society is the tightly woven web of relationships that bind us together for the survival of the species. This is a social network diagram, a kind of chart often used in the social sciences. On this chart, each dot represents a person, and each blue line represents a relationship connecting two people. Society, in the capital S sense, is represented by all the blue on the chart. But you'll notice that all the blue forms a series of larger or smaller areas on the chart, and those black dots cluster with the dense blue areas. The relationships among those people are tying them together and pulling them into closer groups. Those clusters represent societies in the lowercase s sense. You'll also notice that the boundaries of each society are porous, with some relationships spanning across multiple societies. So society, capital S, is an integrating force that ties together people into lowercase s societies. How it accomplishes that is kind of complex. Society acts as an organizing principle that helps determine how people behave. It allows us to understand and predict the behaviors of others, without which we couldn't productively live together in social groups. After all, if everyone else's actions were a complete mystery to you, why would you feel an attachment to that group and a desire to remain? So society integrates because it organizes behavior. That social organization operates on a variety of levels, which we'll cover in detail throughout the course. The largest level is that of the social institution. A social institution is a domain of social interaction, a particular way that we interact with others. Remember Cloquon's definition. A society is made up of people who interact with one another for certain ends. Each distinct end or goal forms a distinct social institution. Examples of social institutions include politics, which is about group decision-making, religion, which is about dealing with the supernatural, the household, about economic cooperation, the family, about the raising of the next generation, and so forth. Institutions are the overarching concepts that structure the society and divide it into comprehensible kinds of relationships. But institutions are not the basic units of social organization. Those are social statuses. Statuses are named social positions that identify the people involved in the different kinds of interactions in that institution. For example, the statuses of citizen and president are both components of the institution of government. Whenever people interact for that purpose, to accomplish the end of government, they must take on one of the relevant statuses. Every person in society occupies many statuses simultaneously, but different statuses are relevant in different situations. A person may hold the status of manager when at work, in the business institution, and the same person may hold the status of father at home, where the family institution is relevant. With each status comes a social role. A role is a set of behaviors, obligations, and rights that make up a particular status. For example, the status of father comes with the obligations to raise children, the right to make decisions for them, and it implies certain kinds of behavior like working to provide food and shelter. Different statuses have different roles. The status of CEO implies different obligations than father. A social agent, that is, someone in a social situation, recognizes which institution is relevant and then recognizes which statuses belong to himself and other agents. By knowing the roles that are relevant to any given situation and the behaviors associated with them, you can understand and predict the behavior of others, and that makes living together with one another possible. For example, if you suddenly found yourself in a room with a long chalkboard along one wall, many desks facing that wall, and a single larger desk facing the others, you'd recognize that room as a classroom. You'd then know that whatever interactions were going on in that room belonged to the education institution. That means that the single person standing at the front of the room and talking has the status of teacher, and all the others sitting at the desks have the status of students. Since a student's role is to listen quietly and take notes, you can expect those people to do so. Meanwhile, the teacher's role is to lecture, so you can expect that person to continue talking. The only remaining question is, how do you behave? What is your status? Student, guest lecturer, observer, and what role does that status play in the classroom setting? Once you've determined that, you can take part in the class productively and without disrupting others. It's that kind of information gathering and decision-making process that allows society, the institutions, statuses, and roles, to structure people's behaviors in a way that makes social living possible and productive. Turning now to culture, we're going to start with the abstract capitalized meaning. As with the capital S society, capital C culture cannot be plural and cannot take an article. Society, capital S, is made possible by deciding the roles and behaviors that are relevant for a given situation and behaving appropriately. Culture, capital C, is what helps you make those decisions. It's the concepts and ideas that everyone in a society shares about what is and isn't appropriate and how things should work. The most famous definition of culture was given by Edward Tylor in the late 19th century, when the social sciences were just getting started. He said, "Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a person as a member of society." If he followed the same convention I do, that last word would be capitalized. Notice that even at this early stage, Tylor is recognizing that the primary function of culture is to help one be part of society, and he's focusing on how these ideas guide one's behaviors. That's capital C culture. A culture, lowercase c, is the group of people who share culture. In this sense, we can pluralize the word and talk about many cultures, or we can add an article. In both cases, the lowercase, more concrete meaning of the term refers to a particular group of people with certain shared characteristics. A society is a group of people who share interactions. A culture is a group of people who share ideas about how to interact. And since culture is tied to society, two individuals who belong to the same society very often belong to the same culture as well. Just as the boundaries of a given society are often fuzzy, so are the boundaries of a given culture. Your book discusses national, international, and subcultures, which differ from one another in what kinds of rules and ideas are shared among the members of the community, and how widely those ideas are shared. When a cultural group is smaller than the larger society, it's a subculture. When the cultural ideas can be found in many societies, the cultural group is larger than the society. It's called international culture. But let's step back a bit and go back to capitalized C culture. Culture is the unifying theoretical concept of anthropology. All branches of anthropology, all anthropological studies, share in common the idea that culture structures human behavior and makes society possible. Culture, that body of ideas about behavior, has certain characteristics that make this structuring possible. First, as in the definition of lowercase c culture, culture is shared. Most or all of the people in a society will share the beliefs, values, and behaviors that make up their culture. Because people share the belief that certain behaviors are appropriate and certain ideas are true, people are able to understand and predict the actions of others. We can get inside the heads of others. We know why they do the things they do, because we know that they, more or less, think the same way we do. Without this kind of built-in predictability, society would be impossible, because the actions of others would be incomprehensible and we'd never be able to establish those regular, lasting relationships that constitute society. So how do the ideas and beliefs that make up culture get to be shared? Culture is learned. Unlike most other animals, which are born instinctively knowing most of what they need to survive, humans must learn almost everything about their lives. The great majority of this learning takes place unconsciously, as children watch their parents and imitate them. Of course, there's also more formal learning like we're engaged in right now. All societies have some form of instruction where an adult teaches children, but usually that instruction is for more complex things: hunting, wood carving, how to make a ceramic pot, so on. And usually that instruction doesn't take place until the child is older, after many of the basic aspects of culture have already been learned. This brings us to a third characteristic of culture. It is usually adaptive. By adaptive, I mean that it functions to allow humans to survive in their environment. Culture is a non-biological way of changing to suit the environment, just like natural selection is a biological way of changing. In fact, as your textbook spends some time discussing, it's clear that there are evolutionary bases for our cultural capabilities. Our nearest living relatives, the great apes, share our cultural capabilities to a lesser degree. It seems that culture is something that we have evolved to do, and that it adapts us to our environment in much the same way that physical evolution adapts all species. There are two consequences of the idea that culture is adaptive, that it's also integrated and constantly changing. Integrated means that the ideas and behaviors that constitute culture are not randomly combined, but all function together as a whole. A change in one part of the system will always bring about a change in other parts of the system. That culture is changing is a result of the fact that the environment is always changing. A culture's environment is not just the physical features of the landscape, but also the social environment of other people. As the environment changes, people's ideas change in response to it. Some ideas, like what kind of clothing is cool, will change much faster than others, like religion. But some aspects of culture are always changing because the environment that they adapt to is also always changing. Okay, let's talk about some of the most obvious objections that might arise to that description of culture. First, if culture is shared, does that mean that everyone in a culture always thinks and acts exactly the same way? Of course not. Within a culture, there is always a certain degree of individual variation. There exists a range of ideas that are more or less similar but distinct that an individual is able to choose from. The larger body of cultural ideas is said to be contested. Individuals and smaller groups that have different ideas undertake a debate with one another in an attempt to influence the larger society. This debate is called social discourse. For example, think about politics. Most every American agrees that the best form of government is a democratic republic where officials are elected by the populace and act as representatives of their constituency. That much is part of our shared national culture. But within that cultural idea is a huge range of variation of individual ideas. States' rights versus federal government, Republican versus Democrat versus Green Party, liberal versus conservative. Every election is a discourse. Which specific form of democratic rule will the society adopt for the next several years? Well, if people are free to choose their individual expression of a shared cultural trait, what keeps them from choosing something radically different? If everyone in a culture shares similar ideas, who determines how similar is similar enough? This is where cultural norms come into play. Norms are usually unstated rules about what sorts of behavior are expected, which are tolerated, and which are completely unacceptable. Norms set the range of acceptable variation, and individuals are free to choose a personal opinion from within that range. If they break a norm, they're subject to sanctions. Sometimes the sanction is informal, whispers, gossip, being avoided. Sometimes those sanctions are formal, like imprisonment or even execution. Some norms are strictly enforced, like religious prohibitions, and others are more loosely enforced, like not jaywalking. Practice theory is an approach in anthropology that focuses closely on the agency of individuals. That is, how they make these sorts of personal decisions and how they participate in the contesting of larger cultural ideas. Older schools of thought focused much more on the shared and integrated aspects of culture, treating every member of the community as basically interchangeable. Practice theory seeks to wrestle with the problem of individual variation and agency. Another obvious problem one might see with the description of culture is the difference between the ideal cultural traits, typified by cultural norms and the explicit statements of individuals, and the actual behavior of the members of the culture, that is, their real culture. Not everyone does as they say they do. They say they share certain ideas and values, but then their actions show that those values are actually contested. Go back to the example of American politics. Just about everyone agrees that public participation in elections is necessary for good government, but in the 2016 presidential election, only about 60% of eligible voters actually cast a ballot. Does that mean that 40% of Americans are lying when they say that voting is important, or is something else going on? As anthropologists, we generally want to determine both the ideal and actual patterns of behaviors, and then determine why the two don't match. That mismatch may tell us more about how people's lives actually play out than their own explicit statements about the matter. Making sense of human behavior can be difficult for a variety of reasons that we'll touch on during the course. But right now I want to address a particularly basic obstacle to anthropological research: ethnocentrism. Break that down into its parts. Ethno, meaning culture, and centrism, meaning at the center. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to see one's own culture as better than others, as if it were at the center and all other cultures were defined by how close they are to it. More technically, ethnocentrism is the tendency to judge other cultures by the standards of one's own. So we may look at a culture that practices arranged marriages and judge that to be barbaric, because our own concept of marriage involves individual choice and romantic love. Others may look at our own marriage customs and think they're utterly reckless, because romantic love seldom ensures a newly married couple will make a good economic partnership. Ethnocentrism is not something that can ever be escaped. It is pretty basic to human nature to always think that one's own ways are the best. But as scientists, we have to work hard to recognize and limit ethnocentrism in our work. Just saying that arranged marriages are barbaric does nothing to help us understand why people engage in them, how they help the culture to survive, or why the practice even developed in the first place. If, as social scientists, we want to understand and explain the relationships in human society, we have to get past ethnocentrism and look at arranged marriages on their own terms. This is where cultural relativism comes in. Cultural relativism is the principle that a culture's practices and ideas must be viewed within the context of that culture. As scientists, we describe and judge cultural practices in terms of the culture they belong to. How does the practice function within that culture? Why did it evolve within that culture? We leave our own preconceived notions at the door and study other cultures on their own merits, according to their own environments and problems. Every research question and every explanation is formulated to apply specifically and only to the culture in question. That simple trick of phrasing focuses our attention on the culture in question and reminds us not to apply our own cultural norms to the data. We can't ever quite eliminate ethnocentrism, but cultural relativism helps us to recognize when we're in danger of succumbing to its bias. In the popular imagination, cultural relativism has gotten a bad rap. Even some anthropologists have taken it to mean anything goes, that all cultures are equally valid, and so long as most people in the culture agree on something, it's okay. That line of thinking would mean that things like slavery, torture, and genocide are okay if everyone in the community agrees that they are. These people discard cultural relativism, claiming that it interferes with a higher morality. But cultural relativism in anthropology doesn't mean that at all. Remember that anthropologists are scientists. We use cultural relativism to do science with a minimum of ethnocentrism. Our goal, as always, is an objective study and understanding of human culture. Objective meaning without the bias of our Western morality. To understand cultures as they exist now, we must remain objective and examine cultures through the lens of cultural relativism. But when the study's done and the understanding has been achieved, we're free to be subjective again. We can take the understanding we've acquired and combine it with our personal morality and try to effect changes. This is basically what the field of applied anthropology is about. After we know how the culture operates, what can we do to change it for the benefit of the people? So a commitment to cultural relativism in science doesn't preclude a belief in an absolute morality or that anything goes. It just means that doing good science requires setting aside our own beliefs temporarily. In our next lecture, we'll continue looking at the concept of culture in more detail by focusing specifically on the question of culture change. If culture is a shared set of ideas about how to live with one another, how do those ideas change over time?